We've talked about one or two Pokemon lines that make people slightly uncomfortable. Whether that be because of where they live, like me and the ocean Pokemon, or because they have a certain body type, like the Jinx line. Something that makes the vast majority of people uncomfortable to be around are the Pokemon that look just a little bit too human. It starts to enter that uncanny valley and sets the instincts on edge. Combine that with the relatively common fear of clowns, and you get a Pokemon species much like this one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. If it wasn't already obvious to everyone, today we'll be talking about the mimicry Pokemon Mime Jr. and its evolution Mr. Mime. Mime Jr. is a small Pokemon, standing only about 2 feet tall and weighing about 28.7 pounds on average. That's 0.6 meters and 13 kilos. Its body is predominantly pink, having a pink torso, arms, and face, and its legs are a deep blue color. On top of its head, it looks like it's wearing a crooked hat, sporting the same dark blue color and a white ball at the end. Overall, it really looks like a child dressed as a clown. And that comparison only gets worse when it evolves. Mr. Mime, well, it looks like a man dressed as a clown. Though the proportions of its body kind of look like a bug to me, but that might just be a personal thing. Mr. Mime is a bipedal Pokemon with 2 arms and 2 legs, and whose body is a riotous and confusing mix of the colors white, pink, and blue. Really, describing it doesn't do it justice, so I think this might be the first Pokemon that I say you all just have to go and look up to understand what I'm talking about. Oh, and they usually get to a height of 4 feet 3 inches, 1.3 meters, and weigh about 120 pounds, 54.5 kilos. Before we move on, I should also mention that what we'll be talking about here will be the Cantonian Mr. Mime, not the Galarian version that is Ice-type instead of Fairy-type. That also means we won't be covering Mr. Rime in this guide either. I know that Pokemon is somewhat popular in the Galar region thanks to the dance routines that it puts on, but you'll have to wait for when we get to the Galarian Pokedex for me to talk about them. Now, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the guide and see if these humanoid Pokemon are possibly the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. As with most humanoid Pokemon, and any Pokemon that shows this much intelligence, the enclosure is going to be fairly easy. The best enclosure for these guys is going to be having them live in your home. Having a Mime Jr. in your home is very much going to feel like you're watching over a toddler. And then when they evolve into a Mr. Mime, it changes to having a roommate instead of a toddler living with you. And to that end, they are going to need a lot of the same things that you do. For example, when it comes to sleeping arrangements, it would be best if you get them their own bed. I know that sometimes it has been observed that they use their pantomime abilities to create an invisible bed that they sleep on, which is an insane thing to say out loud, let's be honest here, but that's not something they do all the time. Realistically, the majority of the time, they have been observed preferring to sleep in actual bedding. Now, there are, of course, multiple options when it comes to this, but personally, I feel weird to have these Pokemon that look and act so human sleep on the floor or the couch. And I'm not even going to mention the same bed issue. Therefore, because of all this, I think that the only real solution here is to get the Pokemon its own bed, like a twin-sized bed. Where you put this bed is up to you. You can have them sleep in the same room as you, or you can give them their own room to stay in. I recommend the latter option, as not only does that give your Pokemon its own space, but it might also stop you from waking up in the night and thinking your Pokemon is a sleep paralysis demon. And realistically, that's it for the Enclosure. Oh, there are other smaller things that you have to think of for sure, like the fact that you'll have to either get them their own table to eat from, or get comfortable with them eating from the same table as you. Same with water. Thanks to how smart these Pokemon can be, they can easily be trained to use a glass for water. There aren't any special things you have to do to your house to prepare for them like you do with the Pikachu line. Realistically, they might need some mental stimulation games like the Abra line, but they're often able to entertain themselves and work their minds through the day using their pantomime abilities. So that's also not a major concern with them either. Their Enclosure ends up being pretty easy to contend with overall. Cohabitating with other Pokemon might end up being a challenge though, depending on how your Pokemon was raised and what evolution you have. If we're talking about Mr. Mime, they have a bad tendency to smack anyone and anything that interrupts them when they're doing their pantomime routines, which can be a major issue if you have another Pokemon that gets in their way, or, Arceus forbid, a child. Granted, this is mainly an issue with the wild-caught specimens of the line. Any Mr. Mime evolution that you get from a breeder should be well trained enough to not react that way unless they feel threatened. Mime Jr. isn't as much of an issue. The main thing it'll do is copy the people and Pokemon that are around it. So, if you try to house it with a Pokemon that likes to be left alone, or has a bit of a temper, then that can lead to problems. But aside from that, it's very much like taking care of a kid. In reality, you're going to be restricted to the Pokemon that can live to your house anyway, so there shouldn't be too many problems as long as everything is on the friendlier side. Availability. The Mime Jr. line isn't very common in the wild. First of all, Mime Jr. is classified as a baby Pokemon, and it's one of the ones that only comes about when the parents breed when surrounded by a specific incense smell, in this case the odd incense. As I'm sure you can imagine, that's very hard for these Pokemon to come across in the wild, so finding a wild Mime Jr. is gonna be pretty tough for you. Combine that with the already scarce nature of the line in general, and getting the first evolution in the wild is more of a pipe dream than anything. Which means that, for those of you that do want to go out and catch one of these Pokemon, then you had better start trying to catch a Mr. Mime, which might be easier, but not by much. For one, they only appear in very specific areas, like routes 218 and 222 in Sinnoh, Glimmering Cave in Kalos, and Route 21 in Kanto. There's also the slight possibility that you can run into one on Route 20 in Unova, but reports of that are spotty at best. One interesting thing is that there seems to be a population of them that's surviving within the city limits of, and people in Alola, I'm very sorry if I butcher this name, Howley City in Alola? Which does make sense given the ease with which they tend to live alongside humans. I should also mention that the Trophy Garden here in Sinnoh has been known to stock Mime Juniors from time to time, so you might have a chance of getting one from there if you really want a Mime Junior. But for those of you that live in the Johto, Hoenn, and Paldean regions, then I'm sorry, you're out of luck getting a wild Mr. Mime. Oh, and for those of you in the Galar region, I'm sure you're already aware of this, but you won't be able to find wild populations of Cantonian Mr. Mime in your region, thanks to the prevalence of the Galarian form. You can find Mime Jr. though, as both lines begin at that point. If you do want to hunt one down in Galar, then your best bet is to find one in the rolling fields, but again, it's going to be rare, and if you keep the Mime Jr. in the Galar region, it's most likely going to evolve into Galarian Mr. Mime. That brings us to the breeding industry. And honestly, it's not that great. These Pokemon are some of the worst ones that suffer from the uncanny valley, like a little too close to human effect. Combine that with the clown aesthetic, which many people aren't a fan of, and you end up with a Pokemon that there aren't many people that are clamoring to get a hold of. Mime Jr. are a bit more popular than their evolution, but even then it's too close to a child for many people to be comfortable. The main thing that keeps these Pokemon from being completely ignored by the breeding community is the fact that they are easy Pokemon to own and care for, as we'll see in the care section in a little bit. Even with that one saving grace though, finding someone that you can buy one of these Pokemon from is gonna be a challenge no matter what you do. Catchability. On the off chance that you do decide to try and catch one of these Pokemon from the wild, then there are a few things you have to keep in mind. One is that it's probably going to end up being very annoying to deal with if you don't get the jump on it. Thanks to their psychic abilities, they're able to create solid, invisible planes of air around them, giving them their very mime-ish theme. Trying to throw a Pokeball at them when they have those all around them and you aren't able to see where they are is a major pain, and will lead to a lot of Pokeballs stopping in midair for what seems like no reason at all. To deal with this, you'll either have to tire out and weaken the Mr. Mime in a fight enough that it can't keep up the psychic shenanigans, or, as I mentioned before, get the drop on them from the get-go and hope that the first Pokeball works, or even a Quick Ball, since that's what they're designed for. Mime Jr. is a lot less of a headache to catch, thanks to the fact that it's not entirely proficient with creating the psychic constructs yet. No, the issue there is going to be simply finding one, but I covered that already in the availability section. As for what Pokemon you should bring along with you, your best options are Ghost, Poison, or Steel types. Remember, they are Fairy types as well, it simply doesn't impact their care as much as it does with Clefairy. And when it comes to hardware, a Pokeball should be plenty for Mime Jr., and you can probably get away with a Great Ball for Mr. Mime, but an Ultra Ball will be a lot more effective since you want to try and catch this one quickly. Care. Thanks to there being one of the Pokemon species that live in your home, and not only that, but being one of the smarter Pokemon species out there, these Pokemon have a relatively easy care section. These Pokemon are omnivores, eating both plants and meat, but they tend to heavily favor the vegetarian option. Thank Arceus for that, because the image of them hunting in the wild would be the foundation for a number of horror movies. Mime Jr. actually eats very little meat, which makes sense when you think about it. Since its psychic pantomime abilities are not as strong as its evolution, it can't hunt down prey as well. With Mr. Mime, you'll be looking at a larger portion of the meal being protein-based, but it still won't be a lot. As for how much you should feed them, thanks to how similar they end up being to human biology, most of the realistic diets for these Pokemon online are based on how many calories the Pokemon should take in, not simply weight and ratios of food. For a Mime Jr., you want to have it eat about 1,200 to 1,500 calories a day, divided among 3 meals. Only about 3 or 4 ounces of that should be some sort of meat, with the rest being a roughly equal mixture of fruits, veggies, and grains. When they evolve into a Mr. Mime, then that increases to about 1,800 to 2,100 calories per day, close to what a human of the same size and weight would have to eat. You want to increase the amount of meat to about 8 to 10 ounces per meal, the rest still being a mix of various fruits, veggies, and grains, now only giving them 2 meals a day. How you feed them is a bit of a debate among people online. There are some that think that since they're Pokemon, then feeding them like a Pokemon with a dish somewhere in the house is perfectly fine. Others, like myself, feel that having a Pokemon that is so humanoid and incredibly smart on top of that, I just find that to be a very weird feeling to have that creature just sitting on the floor eating out of the dish. What many people do is actually train them to eat at the table, much like you would with another person. It's really a matter of preference what you decide to do, but keep in mind that the latter option might take a bit more training in the long run. Speaking of training, you will have to do a bit of that with these Pokemon. Of course, there's the basic stuff like food training and bathroom training, which, a word of advice on the latter, teach this Pokemon how to use the inside toilet. They are way too humanish to be going in the yard like your Rockruff does, and you're bound to get the authorities called on you for that. However, one of the more important things that you have to train out of these Pokemon is their violent reaction to having their pantomime routines interrupted. They have a tendency to smack the crap out of whatever does it, and if you have other Pokemon, small children, or even other people who do it by accident, well, they're gonna get a good smacking. The best way to deal with this is while the Pokemon is still a Mime Jr., because at that point they don't have the strength to smack anyone, and their psychic abilities aren't strong enough to do any major damage to anything yet. What we're going to be doing is kind of exposure therapy, where we repeatedly interrupt the Pokemon while it's trying to perform, rewarding a positive or no reaction to it, and discouraging negative reactions. It's almost like picking up a Growlithe's food bowl while it's eating so they don't become food aggressive. But with this, you have to strike a careful balance. You want the Pokemon to understand that, while it might not like it, being interrupted is fine. But you don't want the Pokemon to think that it's not allowed to do its pantomime routine at all. That can lead to plenty of mental and emotional issues down the road, like neurotic behaviors, bad habits, and even more serious things like depression. Over time, your Pokemon should get used to the interruptions and not even react to you when you do it. Of course, if you get your Pokemon from a breeder, then this training should already be done. The big issue comes when you catch a fully evolved Mr. Mime out of the wild. At this point in the Pokemon's life, those habits are going to be fully ingrained in them, and it's going to be a royal pain to try and get them to unlearn that. Not to mention that using the method that we mentioned for Mime Jr. is going to be a lot more dangerous at this point thanks to how much stronger Mr. Mime is than a Mime Jr. At that point, you might have to get a professional trainer involved to avoid you getting hurt and ruining your relationship with the Pokemon so early on. Thankfully, these Pokemon are very smart, as psychic Pokemon tend to be, so it should pick up on what you're trying to teach it relatively quickly. Speaking of which, I should mention some of the higher level training you can do with these Pokemon. We won't get into it here as these are very much supplemental stuff, but thanks to the fact that they are so humanoid and they are very smart, there are many cases where people have been able to train them and teach them how to help out around the house. I mean, I've seen videos online of Mr. Mime vacuuming, doing dishes, folding laundry, the whole 9 yards. Now, of course, I can't condone you just getting a Pokemon so you can have a maid cleaning up your house. It is a living creature, and getting one just so you don't have to take care of your household chores is terrible. Teaching it to help out is one thing, but simply using it as an unpaid labor is something I won't perpetuate. It is a living being and deserves to live in a home where it is seen as more than just the help. With that being very clear, if you do want to teach your Pokemon how to do these kinds of things, there are training guides for it online, or you can even hire a trainer to teach your Pokemon for you. The last thing that you have to worry about care-wise for these guys actually only applies to Mime Jr., and the fact that it's classified as a baby Pokemon. For those of you that haven't listened to the previous guides where we talk about baby Pokemon, what classifies a Pokemon as a baby Pokemon are the facts that it's born through a special method, and it does not have full control over its own power upon birth. For some, like Pichu and its electricity, this can lead to them being dangerous and needing special care that can make them hard for the average person to care for and to have. But for others, like Mime Jr., it's less dangerous and more that they just need practice with their abilities. In fact, there is even research that shows that the control over these abilities is what triggers their evolution into a Mr. Mime. So, if you do end up getting a Mime Jr., then one of the things you'll have to do is play with it. Interact with it on a regular basis and allow it to mimic your movements. Stretch its abilities by doing things it's never seen before, taking it to places with many different people in Pokemon that it can try to copy, and always expose your Pokemon to new things. This will have the double benefit of increasing the skill of your Mime Jr. with its psychic abilities, but it will also get your Pokemon much more used to interacting with the world and desensitizing them to new stimuli. I should also mention that if you're looking to have your Pokemon increase its skills and evolve as fast as possible, then the best method is to house your Mime Jr. with a Mr. Mime. Obviously, learning something from someone who is already proficient in what you're trying to learn is going to be much faster than learning on your own. Just be prepared to trip over invisible things that your Pokemon ends up making on the floor. From what I've seen online, it's a pretty common occurrence with these guys. Cost. As with all of the Pokemon that you can keep in your house, the Enclosure shouldn't be more than the low category. Since all you really need to get for these guys is a bed, I can see it dipping down into the very low category, but if you want to get anything extra for them through the house, then your best bet is to just assume the low category. Considering that their diet isn't going to be much more than feeding another person, their food shouldn't be that much. With Mime Jr., it'll be less, probably in the low or the beginning of the moderate category per month. Mr. Mime will pretty much add another whole adult to your grocery bill, bringing it up into the high end of the moderate category, or even into the high category itself, depending on what you buy and where you live. The Pokemon will probably be the part that'll cost you the most. Thanks to how rare they are in the breeding industry, I don't see them being too expensive. After all, you aren't really going to have to wait on a list or compete with others to get one. But the fact that there's so few breeders out there, combined with the fact that anyone with a breeding program will be pretty much taking care of a bunch of other people, the price could easily slide into the moderate or the high category. Conclusion. Why are the creepy clown Pokemon the ones that make great pets? Okay, realistically, as long as they are trained to deal with interruptions, then these Pokemon would be great for anyone. Mime Juniors would be great for households with small kids. Mr. Mimes are great for people that just want a Pokemon that can really take care of itself. Both of them can make great companions for people of any circumstances. I honestly cannot see many flaws with these Pokemon, and the fact that it's the Mime Junior line I'm saying that about makes me supremely uncomfortable. And that's really their only downside that I can see. If you don't like clowns, or the Pokemon are too close to human looking, then I can't recommend them for you. But if you're looking for a very easy companion Pokemon, then the Mime Junior line could very easily end up being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the sharp-handed Pokemon Scyther and its two evolutions, Scizor and Kleavor. Have a wonderful night, everyone. As we all know, there are Pokemon out there that can be very dangerous. For some of them, it's their attitude and temperament that make them dangerous. Others, it's really their biology that makes them dangerous. They, in and of themselves, don't necessarily want to hurt you, but there's something about them that is inherently harmful to humans. Unfortunately, the Pokemon line that is the subject of today's guide has both of these issues somewhere in their evolutionary tree. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the sharp, swift Pokemon Scyther, and its two divergent evolutions Scizor and Kleavor. I know that some of you might be confused by Kleavor's inclusion in this, as many of you have no doubt thought that evolution went extinct and was no longer possible. Well, I'm happy to report that it's not. It's just teetering on the edge of extinction. It is still technically possible to find the needed material to evolve your Scyther into a Kleavor, there's just a lot of complications when it comes to doing so, which we'll talk about later on in the guide. For now, just know that it is still technically possible. So, Scyther itself is a bipedal bug-type Pokemon, with a green exoskeleton and thin, cream-colored parts that connect the body segments. Their head is somewhat reptilian in shape, with 3 small crests above its eyes. Its legs are long, with 3 sharp claws on each foot, and a dual pair of wings on its back that it uses for speed and occasional flight. Oh, and it has 2 massive blades that extend from its elbow down, and they are sharp enough that it uses them to hunt prey fairly effectively. They are pretty impressive to see. The Scyther stands at a tall 4 foot 11 inches, 1.5 meters, and weighs an average of 123.5 pounds, 56 kilograms, which I have to imagine that a lot of that is just the weapons attached to its arms. Now, normally, if left alone, they won't evolve on their own. The 2 ways that Scyther can evolve are either through being traded while holding onto a metal coat, a specific item, leading to a Scizor, or when they're exposed to a certain type of black volcanic stone called a black augurite, leading to a Kleavor. Both of them keep the same overall body plan as Scyther, but Scizor is now covered in a thick layer of red and black steel. Their bladed arms have changed, now looking more like crab pincers, with black and yellow markings that look a lot like eyes, making the claws look almost like more heads. Aside from that, it's really only the small details that make this Pokemon look different from its previous evolution. As you can imagine with its new metal exoskeleton, Scizor is both heavier and taller than its previous evolution, standing 5 feet 11 inches and weighing about 260 pounds. That's 1.8 meters and 118 kilograms. However, if you instead manage to get your hands on a piece of volcanic rock, which I'll remind you is very rare these days, then you might be able to evolve your Scyther into a Kleavor. Kleavor has nearly the same body plan as Scizor, even being the same height. But instead of the red metallic exoskeleton, Kleavor instead has a beige tan color. Its body also looks a lot more angular and sharper, matching the darker rock protrusions that are around its shoulders and head. Lastly, Scyther's sword-like arms are now replaced by large stone axe heads on each hand, which it can use to chop through things like trees with ease. Oh, and I should mention that it no longer has any functioning wings, unlike the other 2 in this line, only having small vestigial remains on Kleavor's back. Kleavor also falls in between Scyther and Scizor in the weight category, averaging around 192 pounds or 89 kilos. We're going to talk more about this later on in the availability section, but I should also mention that it is nearly impossible for you to manage to get a Kleavor these days, to the point where this evolution is nearly considered to be an extinct form. I'm still going to talk about it and what you need to care for one, but be aware that it's going to be much more of a process and an issue than the other 2 are. But if any of these sound like they would be interesting for you to keep, then let's get into the guide and see if these weapon-wielding bugs could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. In the wild, these Pokemon tend to live in the transition areas between forests and grasslands. From the research that I've been able to find, they hunt their prey in the grasslands, using their speed in the open space to quickly ambush that prey, and then they retreat and live in the forests, using the trees and their camouflage to blend in and hide from potential predators. Yes, these Pokemon, even with their natural weapons and speed, aren't the top of the food chain, as is the ever-present worry of the bug-type Pokemon. But we want to try to replicate that environment as best we can. To that end, you should have half of the enclosure be open, allowing the grass to grow tall. On the other half, you want to have a handful of trees, all grown far apart enough that these Pokemon are able to move around with ease. That also means that you'll have to do the job of going in there and removing any brush that starts to grow in between the trees, so that the Pokemon are able to stay comfortable. As I'm sure you can imagine, this means that these Pokemon are going to need a lot of space, not only to contain the two separate environments, but also to allow your Pokemon to move about enough to be comfortable. Thankfully, these Pokemon, while large in size, are still ambush predators, meaning that they spend a large portion of their time staying still. Even still, you want these enclosures to be at least 150 feet by 100 feet. That's about the same square footage as the average house in Unova, so plenty of space for them to move. That should be plenty of space for them to stay comfortable without going overboard. Unfortunately, thanks to the fact that both Scyther and Scizor can fly, and Kleavor's jumping abilities are insane, you'll have to build an enclosure that has a roof on it to contain them, one that's about 20 feet up. However, the material that's used in the building has been something that's been up for debate among owners for this line for some time. For example, let's say that you decide to go with a form of reinforced plexiglass for the walls and ceiling. That would be perfect for Scyther, as they won't be able to slash through it. But for Scizor, and to a lesser extent Kleavor, that might lead to issues. Both Scizor and Kleavor use heavy impacts from their fists, and Scizor is composed of metal, so there's an even bigger chance that it'll be able to shatter the walls at some point. But you can't go with a mesh either. It might resist the blunt impacts, but the slashing from both Kleavor and Scyther will cut right through it. So you need something that can withstand being cut through, but isn't so rigid that a heavy, blunt impact will do a ton of damage. Currently, the consensus online appears to be that having a mesh netting of reinforced steel cable functioning as the walls and ceiling of the enclosure is your best bet at containing these Pokemon effectively. This does have the added benefit of allowing things like fresh air and sunlight directly into the enclosure, and allowing the grass and trees to grow naturally. Speaking of the trees, the best way to handle them is to either get trees that are small enough that they'll be able to grow in the enclosure without messing with the mesh ceiling, or planting the trees first and then anchoring the mesh to the trees afterward. Keep in mind that both of these options do come with their own issues. If you get the smaller trees, then they'll most likely be small enough that Scyther, Kleavor, and maybe even Scizor will be able to break right through them. But if you decide to get the taller trees and anchor the mesh to them, then that can create weak points that the Pokemon can exploit and get out of the enclosure. Either way, whichever one you decide to go with, you'll have to deal with the consequences afterward. Considering you'll be making an outdoor enclosure that'll be open to the elements, you will have to build a small shelter for the Pokemon to take cover in for things like inclement weather. It doesn't need to be anything super fancy. These Pokemon will really only use it to take cover from things like rain and heavy wind. Oh, which reminds me, these Pokemon do not do well in the cold. Scizor and Kleavor do better in it than Scyther does, thanks to their steel and rock types giving them some inherent protection from it. But if you live in a place where the winters get harsh, then you might want to look into building something more enclosed than what we've described so far. Back to the shelter, it just has to be a small 10-foot square thing with a ceiling that is open on one side, allowing the Pokemon to enter the space without having to evolve the weapons that they all have. It should be constructed out of concrete or some similar material. I know I said that concrete, which is rigid, wouldn't hold up to some of the Pokemon's strikes, but this smaller area is much less likely to get smacked than if you had built the entire enclosure out of it. On the inside, you'll need to get them some bedding. I recommend something simple and easy to replace in case your Pokemon decides to do some redecorating. Something like leaves, which they can use in the wild, or you can use something like wood shavings, which you can buy online. Lastly, when we look at the Pokemon that these guys do well with, Scyther and Scizor are actually very social Pokemon with their own kind, and with each other. It's been seen that large groups of them gather in the wild, and after a bit of combat to figure out who's in charge, they get along just fine. Kleavor, though, is the odd one out here. Thanks to how aggressive this evolution is, it can be hard to have multiples of them in the same enclosure without them constantly fighting with each other. They can also cause problems with the other two evolutions if they feel like their spot at the top of the pack is threatened by one of the others. It might just be best to leave Cleavor on its own. And then, when we expand the search to include other Pokemon, then we find that really no other species are great to house with these Pokemon. Small Pokemon that could be considered prey for these guys are an immediate no. So small bug types, small mammals like Rattata, and even a few of the smaller flying types. You also want to avoid anything that is vulnerable to the kind of damage that these Pokemon are going to be dishing out with their weapon arms. And, of course, you don't want anything that is too aggressive and will try to start a fight with your Scyther evolution. In all of these stipulations, there aren't very many good cohabitants for the Scyther line, so it might be best just to keep them with others of their own evolutionary line. Availability. Despite the fact that these Pokemon can be very social, they're actually very hard to find in the wild. I mean, they don't even appear in Kanto, Johto, Unova, Hoenn, and mainland Galar. And before any of you start writing comments, Scyther used to be housed in the old Safari Zone in Fuchsia City and Kanto before it shut down. The ones that can be found in the National Park in Johto are specifically stocked for the bud-catching tournaments, and then they're all caught afterwards by professionals, which is why you can't find them outside of those tournaments. There are no wild populations in those regions naturally. As for the other regions, they tend to only appear in one or a couple of places. Kalos has some on Route 21, Alola has the Pony Plains, Sinnoh has routes 210, 215, and 229. I should say that there are technically some Scyther in Galar, but they aren't on the mainland, instead living in the training lowlands on the Isle of Armor. Funny enough, Scyther actually has a fairly big presence in the Paldea region, living in the South Province areas 4 and 6, and the North Province around Casaroya Lake and the Sokarat Trail, as well as generally in Area 2. Mind you that these Pokemon are notorious for avoiding people when they see you, hence they are very hard to track down, so if you go to one of these places, you probably won't spot one of them right away. As for its evolutions, well, it's not great. They are both exceedingly rare in the wild, though for different reasons. Scizor is rare because it's a trade evolution that also requires an item, a metal coat, to be involved. Meaning that for a wild Scizor to come about, a Scyther either needs to be in contact with, or in close proximity to, a metal coat, which is a man-made item, mind you, while being exposed to a very specific electrical charge that is almost never seen outside of a trading machine. That is nearly never going to happen, and is the reason that most wild Scizor that you find are actually escaped or let go Pokemon from trainers. And as for Cleavor, it's even less likely to be found than Scizor if you can believe that. You see, Cleavor is actually an older evolution of Scyther, one that is much more common back in the days when Sinnoh was still known as the Hisui region. Back then, there was a mineral substance known as black augurite, a mineral that functioned for Scyther much like evolution stones do with other Pokemon lines. When a Scyther was exposed to a piece of black augurite, it would trigger an evolution into a Cleavor. Just from that explanation, you would assume that Cleavor would be much more common than Scizor. After all, its evolution method can actually be found in nature. The issue is that black augurite is a very rare and very finite material, and has become so rare over the years that wild Cleavor have gone extinct. I regret to say that there have been no reports of any wild Cleavor sighted since the old Hisui days, and even then it was starting to become very rare. At this point, the one and only place you can find a wild Cleavor is the Terrarium Dome at Blueberry Academy, which is a place I try to avoid mentioning in these guides because it's a man-made environment, hence any Pokemon there are placed there deliberately, and the fact that you have to be a student of the Academy to gain entrance. And even there, the Kleavor evolution is still among the rarest Pokemon to spot in the terrarium. If you're looking to have a Kleavor, then I regret to inform you that finding a wild one is going to be impossible. When we look at the breeding scene for this evolutionary line, it's not the most robust market out there, but it's also not some obscure Pokemon that you only find 1 or 2 people breeding in the entire world. That's mostly thanks to the popularity that Scyther and Scizor have in the battling sport around the world. I mean, there are plenty of people out there that want this Pokemon just off the cool factor alone, and anyone planning on specializing in the bug type consider the Scyther line to be one of the better additions they can make to their teams. But these guides are not for Pokemon battling. They talk about keeping the Pokemon as companions and part of a household. And in that regard, there aren't that many people that want something that seems so dangerous to be around. All that to say, if you want to get a Scyther or a Scizor, you will be able to find one, just be aware that the person is going to expect you to be a Pokemon battling trainer. Kleavor, though, is still something that is probably going to be beyond your reach. Considering you can't breed Kleavor to get more Kleavor, you or a breeder needs to get their hands on some black augurite to evolve it yourself. And, to put it frankly, that's not going to happen. Black augurite has become so rare to find that a lot of governments have been collecting it in the name of conservation, especially the Citadel government on the basis of cultural heritage preservation. In essence, the argument is that there are a limited number of Kleavor that can exist in the future, and they don't want to allow just anyone to evolve a Scyther into a Kleavor and then have it not be well taken care of. If you want a Kleavor, you'll have to apply for one, then you, your Pokemon, and your Enclosure will need to be vetted by your government, and let me tell you, I've heard stories online about how everything went swimmingly for people, and they still get denied. Oh, and to top it all off, it's actually illegal for someone to sell a Kleavor. They can only give them up for conservation care, so a breeder can't do this for you. I hate to say it, but if you try to go this way to get a Kleavor, your chances are slim to none. Catchability. I'm just going to start this part by saying that I, personally, don't think the average person should be hunting for these Pokemon out in the wild. I know that they generally have a more avoidant attitude towards people, but there have been reports of them becoming aggressive and attacking instead. And thanks to the fact that they have weapons for hands, that can end very badly for you, especially if you don't see them coming. Which, I remind you, is highly likely since they are ambush predators and are well known for their speed, especially Scyther. Again, I know that they are more than likely to run away from you as they are to fight you. But in my opinion, even the small chance of getting attacked by a creature with massive knives for hands is still too big of a chance. So if you decide you really want a wild-caught member of this species, then I think you should hire a professional trainer to go out and catch one for you. If you do go out and hunt for these Pokemon yourself, then fire types are going to be your friend. They are the most effective way to protect yourself from a possible attack of these Pokemon. Always keep your head on a swivel when you're searching for them, and remember, the goal is to try and see them before they see you. And don't forget to let someone know where you are going and when you should be back. That way they can alert someone if you end up getting lost or injured. Catching wild Pokemon is always about safety first, and especially with these Pokemon, you don't want to take any chances. If you do manage to get close enough to throw a ball at one of these Pokemon, then obviously use a quick ball if it's unaware of you, but if you end up in a battle, I would recommend using an Ultra Ball for the entire line, no matter what evolutionary stage you end up hunting. Care. feeding with these guys is going to be a point where I know I'm going to lose plenty of you. As I mentioned before, they are ambush predators, and they are well known to not eat anything they find that's already dead. This is one of the main reasons that I think you should definitely get these Pokemon from a breeder instead of getting one from the wild. Aside from the fact that you have a better guarantee that they're healthy and you know the Pokemon's past if you do that. Wild-caught individuals have a very bad transition rate being able to feed on non-live prey, while the ones that are born and raised in captivity are worked on when they're still young, allowing them to more easily make the transition to frozen thawed food. I know that the very idea of feeding a live Pokemon to another Pokemon is a no-go for the vast majority of you, which I don't blame you for. Also, no matter the difference in strength between your Scyther evolution and the prey Pokemon, there's always the chance that live prey will hurt your Scyther Pokemon. I mean, it is fighting for its life after all, so it'll put up a heck of a fight if it can. If you do end up getting a wild individual, or one of the stubborn ones from a breeder that won't make the transition to frozen food, then make sure you keep an eye on it while it feeds, to make sure it doesn't end up getting hurt during the feeding. When it comes to feeding live prey, there are a few things that you should know. One is that you should make sure your Scyther is actually aware that the prey is in the enclosure. I've seen a few reports during my research where the owner just put the prey in the enclosure and it was actually able to escape because the Scyther was just not even aware it was there in the first place. For those of you that do end up getting an individual that has been trained on frozen thawed food, then you have a few extra steps to take care of when it comes to the actual process of feeding. First of all, what you're going to be feeding them are whole, frozen thawed, small bug Pokemon, along the lines of Caterpie or Scatterbug. Every 2 to 3 days, you should thaw out one of the food items. Don't heat them up, that can cook the meat and lead to the Pokemon not eating it. Just let them thaw at room temperature. Also, after it thaws, you should leave all the water on it. That's how these Pokemon get the majority of their water content. Once the food is thawed out, then find your Pokemon in their enclosure and, after getting their attention, move to the closest wall of their enclosure to them. At this point, you need to get a large set of strong steel tongs which you're going to use to hold the food through the metal mesh of the enclosure. Once you get to that point, you need to move the food around, wiggling it and shaking it. It might seem a bit gruesome, but the goal with this is to try and mimic the movement that the prey would have if it was alive, enticing your Scyther evolution to spring and feed. Now, be sure to keep a strong grip on the tongs, as when these Pokemon spin into feeding mode, they will strike hard and they will strike fast. And if you don't have a good grip on those tongs, they'll be ripped right out of your hands, and you'll have to go into the enclosure to get them. At this point in the feeding, you can walk away, as these Pokemon aren't the cleanest eaters, and watching them use those weapons on their hands to tear into prey can be rather unnerving. And that point does segue us nicely into the cleaning portion of the guide. Of course, there's going to be the normal stuff that you have to clean up, like the bits of molted exoskeleton or waste from the Pokemon, but one of the biggest and more disgusting things you'll have to clean up in the enclosure is the remainder of food. This won't be too bad for those of you that are able to get an individual feeding on the frozen food. In that case, you'll only have to clean up some exoskeleton bits that are left laying around and the occasional bit of meat. In the live feeding case, though, things can get a lot more grisly. In that case, you'll have to scrub and clean up bits that are significantly more, gooey and fresh, if you get my meaning. It's not pleasant from what I saw, and will require someone with a very strong stomach to take care of. Whether you do frozen or live feedings, be sure to scrub as much of the area as you can with a Pokemon safe sanitizer so as to avoid any buildup of bacteria in the enclosure. When it comes to training these Pokemon, yes, it is possible, at least for a Scyther and Scizor. If, by one of Arceus's miracles, you manage to get a Cleavor, they're actually far more aggressive than their counterparts in the evolutionary line. It has widely been described as rough and crude, with a temperament that's best avoided if you ever encounter it. I'm not saying they're completely untrainable when they get to this point, but that you would have a lot better success when it comes to these guys if you train your Scyther first, then evolve it into a Cleavor. When it comes to Scyther and Scizor, they can be trained somewhat. They're very intelligent Pokemon, so trying to train them is actually really simple, like most Pokemon. Use food to gain the trust, slowly push the limits of what you and the Pokemon are comfortable doing when near and with each other. But the issue is the weapons and speed that these Pokemon have. With other Pokemon, if things start to go sideways, you at least have the chance to get out of the enclosure or put them in their Pokeball before things get too bad. And some of them aren't even that bad if they do get a hold of you. But these Pokemon? Scizor can break bones with how strong they hit with those clackers of theirs. And Scyther can take off limbs if it strikes at a good angle. So, while they can be trained, I'm sorry, but in my opinion, it's way too dangerous for the average person to attempt it. Thankfully, if you are getting your Pokemon from a breeder, then they should come pre-trained, meaning that you can at least enter the enclosure and get close to the Pokemon without the worry of being attacked. If you end up getting an untrained or wild-caught one, then you should hire a professional Pokemon trainer to come in and handle all of the training for you. I know that can end up being very expensive, but it's best so you don't end up in the hospital and then be only able to count to 5 with all of your fingers. As for the last few minute things you'll have to do when it comes to care for these Pokemon, a water bowl is a must for them, something big and solid that they'll have a hard time breaking, like concrete or metal. You should check it every day, either if it needs to be refilled or cleaned. Unless you're sure that your Pokemon is trained enough to leave you alone while you're in the enclosure with them, you should also put them in their Pokeball when you do this. When you feed your Scizor, you should make sure to add in an iron supplement for their food. This will help their body have the needed requirements for them to heal their outer shell in case it gets damaged. You can use either a hard tablet for this or a powder, but your Pokemon can easily find the tablet and just not eat it or spit it out, so I always prefer to coat their food in a powder. Be sure to regularly check the mesh walls and ceiling of the enclosure. If the Pokemon has managed to damage any of the cables, then not only could that present a potential weak point in the walls for your Pokemon to escape through, but the frayed metal can present a scratching or impaling hazard to a Scyther. This is not as much of a concern for Scizor and Cleavor thanks to their harder exoskeletons, but since they're the ones that are more likely to damage the cables than a Scyther is, it's still a good habit to have. With Pokemon that can be as naturally dangerous as this line can, precaution is always better than regret. Cost. The enclosure is going to cost you a decent amount of money. Between the size, the need for quite a few trees to be planted or cleared, depending on if the ground is already forest or grassland, and the amount of metal mesh that you'll have to install, I really can't see this being less than the very high category. Getting a hold of these Pokemon won't be the most expensive Pokemon in the world, but it's still going to be quite a bit. Like I said before, a lot of people want this evolutionary line on their battling team, so you will absolutely be able to find them out there. But housing a breeding population of these Pokemon isn't easy, as it takes a lot of time, effort, and space. For a Scyther, you're probably looking at the moderate to the high category, and the extra expense of the metal coat for a Scizor will definitely boost it to the high, maybe even the very high category. As for Cleavor, well, it's impossible for me to really put a price on that, since it's nearly impossible for someone to get one. You can either try to get through all the governmental roadblocks, or pay the tuition to get in Blueberry Academy, which isn't cheap in and of itself. And then you'll still have to catch the one after that. Food is the one spot where you might be able to save some money here. Thanks to the fact that they eat some of the most common feeder Pokemon out there, and they only eat every couple days, you'll be able to save quite a bit of money. I can't see you spending more than the moderate category per month on feeding these guys, maybe a bit more if you have a Scizor, since you have to get them supplements on top of the food. Conclusion. What? The Pokemon line that's well known for having weapons for hands and an ambush hunting style is a bad household Pokemon? Who could have seen that coming? In all reality, they aren't that bad. Easy feeding, cool to look at, and no super outrageous care requirements. But the very fact that there is even the possibility of you getting seriously injured just from trying to train these Pokemon removes them from the possibility of being good for most people in my mind. If they were just a bit slower, or weren't predators and only used their weapons for defense, or even had a less dangerous pre-evolution that you can work with and train before they evolve, then that would be a different story. But as things stand, just entering the enclosure presents a major danger. And that's not even mentioning that one of these Pokemon is nearly impossible for you to even get these days. Unless you are someone who has years and years of experience training dangerous Pokemon and are well prepared to handle the possibility of being attacked by one of these guys, I find it really unlikely that these could end up being the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the exceedingly uncomfortable Pokemon Smoochum and its evolution Jinx. Have a wonderful night, everyone. I knew the end of the Kanto Dex was going to be uncomfortable. There's Mr. Mime, Ditto, and even the Elekid and Magmar lines end up being a bit too humanish for me sometimes. It's creepy, and it sends me right into the uncanny valley. But when I look at what was up next after the Scyther line, I realized that I think I blocked this line out because they are by far the worst offenders. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the Ice Psychic types Smoochum and its evolution Jinx. Smoochum is a small, toddler-esque Pokemon with a small humanoid body that's split between a cream-colored chest and arms and a pink bottom. Its head is also pink and round, with large green eyes and a massive set of lips. It tops this with blonde hair that reaches its shoulders and typically has a few strands sticking up on the top of its head. It's also fairly small, standing an average of 1 foot 4 inches (0.4 meters), and only weighing about 13.2 pounds (6 kilograms). I also should mention that Smoochum is found in the group of Pokemon that's known as the baby Pokemon, but I'm not sure that's quite accurate. A common thread through baby Pokemon are the fact that they often come with weakened or unstable abilities, much like how Pichu shocks itself, or how Magby can't fully control its flames yet. Combined with that is the fact that most baby Pokemon come about through some special conditions when they were conceived, such as certain incenses being present when the breeding happens. None of this is needed for Smoochum. They just happen when a Jinx reproduces. I think that it's lumped in with the other baby Pokemon because it was discovered years after Jinx was, only when we truly began to understand how Pokemon breeding worked. Combine that with the fact that it really does give off the vibe of a small toddler or baby, and it's understandable how it was put into that category initially. I would just argue that it shouldn't be there anymore. It really doesn't make sense. Moving on from that, though, after some time, a Smoochum will evolve into its second evolution, Jinx. Jinx is... well... okay, there really isn't any better way to say this. Jinx is a woman. It really looks so much like a human woman. It looks like a woman with purple skin, long blonde hair, 2 arms, and even a red dress with yellow on the chest. Mind you, that isn't actually a dress, that is skin patterns and markings, but it does look like a dress. The biggest difference between this and a human woman is the fact that it doesn't have any feet. Instead, its torso just continues down to meet the floor. Picture if a human body just ended at the hips and didn't have legs. Normally, Jinx stands about 4 feet 7 inches tall, which is 1.4 meters, and weighs about 89.5 pounds, coming out to be about 40.6 kilograms. As I'm sure you can tell by now, this is one of the Pokemon that I don't like the most. They are far, far too human-looking for my liking. I'm not sure if it's an adaptation to be able to better live among humans in ancient times, or if it's some form of defensive camouflage, like evolving to look like a human would deter a predator or something. I don't know. Maybe Dan has a better idea about it. Either way, these Pokemon are some of the prime examples of the humanoid ones that make me, personally, so uncomfortable. But I promised that I would make these guides in the order of the Pokedex, and I will keep my word, so long as we all remember that I'm talking about a Pokemon here. With that kept in mind, let's get into it and see if these Pokemon could possibly be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. Right away, you have to know that this is going to be one of those Pokemon that you can keep in your house. After all, they are very similar to Mr. Mime, which is sometimes incorrectly thought to be their gendered pair. Oh, I just realized I missed this in the intro. Smoochum and Jinx are a female-only species. They don't really have a male counterpart. Mr. Mime is often thrown out as the male counterpart to them, but that's wrong because, weirdly enough, Mr. Mime can also be female. I would argue that the Tyrogue line fits better as the male counterpart to this species, but that isn't a confirmed thing, so you can't take that as fact. Either way, thanks to the intelligence that being a psychic type grants them, they are often very easy to keep in your house with very little difficulty. It really is going to feel like taking care of a child when talking about Smoochum, and taking care of a roommate or something along those lines when we talk about Jinx. Let's get the obvious things out of the way first. They will need a place to sleep, and I'm going to insist that you get these Pokemon their own bed and possibly their own room. I know that cuddling with your Bolthound or your Delcatty at the end of the day while you go to sleep is a common thing, but if you say that you do that with your Jinx, then you might get a lot of weird looks and possibly a visit from some people that are there to check up on your Pokemon's welfare. Getting these Pokemon their own space is a must. Of course, you could always have them sleep on the couch or even in a Pokemon bed on the floor, but that feels so weird with how humanish they are. So getting them their own bed is the simplest and least weird solution. They shouldn't need much considering they aren't that big of a Pokemon. Really, a twin bed should do well for them. One thing is that you want to make sure you get one of the beds that's really close to the ground. With how short Smoochum is, and the fact that Jinx doesn't really have any feet, and therefore doesn't really have much jumping ability, if you get a bed that's high off the ground, then they might have some trouble getting into it. As for where you put the bed, well, my first inclination is to have them situated in an entirely different room than yours, preferably on the other side of the house, but I promise to be scientific and unbiased in these guides, so setting my own ick aside, you can have them realistically anywhere in your house, even sharing the room with yourself, which really isn't a bad idea. Being in the same room makes it easier for them to get your attention if they need to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, or lets you keep a better eye on Smoochum so that it doesn't get into mischief during the night, like how plenty of young Pokemon like to do. As for the rest of the enclosure, it's really going to be small changes to your household to keep you and your Pokemon more comfortable, such as keeping your house at a lower temperature. While these Pokemon can realistically survive at most normal room temperatures, they are ice types, often found in colder spots around the world, and therefore they'll be more comfortable if you keep your house on the colder end, around 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit for the best middle ground of comfort between you and them. That's about 15.5 to 18.3 degrees Celsius for those of you outside the Unova region. Cold? Absolutely. But you won't be able to hang meat from the ceilings or see your breath at those temperatures. Thankfully, they are a fairly smart species, as most psychic types are. Looking at you, Slowpoke. They aren't near the Abra line in intelligence, but they are close behind the Mr. Mime line, meaning they can be taught to use things like cups for water, eating at the table if you want, and even being trained to use the bathroom. Thankfully, they don't really use their psychic abilities for anything in their daily life like some of the other psychic types we've talked about, so you don't have to get them puzzles or toys to keep their minds busy, though there is a certain thing about music that we'll talk about later on. When we look at the Pokemon that can cohabitate with the Smoochum line, they do fairly well with most of the Pokemon that you're able to keep free running in your home. So long as you don't have a specific individual that's more on the aggressive side, then they should at least be able to tolerate the Smoochum line just fine. Though, I should give you a fair warning that Smoochum does like to plant kisses on all kinds of things around its environment. It's how it learns what things are made of and what they are. If you have a Pokemon that you think won't react well to that, then it might be best to rethink about getting a Smoochum. And while these Pokemon don't have to be housed with others of their own species, they do just fine when together. So if you want to get multiples of this line, then you should be just fine, so long as you adjust the housing you have for them. Remember that each one that you get will be like having another person living in your house, and it can easily end up being a lot. Availability. Thanks to their need for colder environments and their predilection for cave environments, it's actually very hard to find these Pokemon in the wild. They only appear in very specific places in some of the regions, and even then they're not that common. You're looking at places like the Seafoam Islands in Kanto, Ice Path in Johto, Frost Cavern in Kalos, Seaward Cave in Alola, and the Snowpoint Temple in Snowpoint City here in Sinnoh. They used to be found in the Giant Chasm in Unova, but that population hasn't been spotted in a while, so they might not be there anymore. The one place that doesn't follow the same examples as the rest of them are in the Crown Tundra in Galar, as Jinx have been known to show up there on the Slippery Slope and Frostpoint Field areas. But, as you can see, all of these places can be rather hard to get to, and even harder to traverse once you get there, filled with ice, hard paths, and other wild Pokemon. If you do decide to try and get one of these Pokemon from the wild, you're probably going to have to travel for the opportunity, and even then, you might have to spend quite some time in those places to get your chance. For those of you in mainland Galar, Paldea, and Hoenn, I'm afraid the trips for you will be even longer than for everyone else, as those regions don't have any native Smoochum populations. Breeders of this Pokemon might as well be just as rare as the wild populations. It's really not common for people to decide to raise these Pokemon simply because of how human they look. A lot of people just feel too uncomfortable around them, especially Jinx, that there isn't that big of a desire for them. The one exception to this are those in the entertainment industry, as Jinx is well known to dance and sing very well when trained. But even then, that's not enough to sustain a large number of breeders out there. Even Smoochum, which is, arguably, less uncomfortable to be around, isn't that popular of a Pokemon, as it looks and acts way too similar to a child. If you really want one of these Pokemon from a breeder, then you had better be ready to put in the work to find them, as it's not gonna be easy. Catchability. Like I said in the availability sections, actually catching these Pokemon is going to be very tricky unless you make sure you're prepared. you need to be sure you're ready to deal with very cold temperatures. Jackets, gloves, thick pants, everything that you can think of to better handle cold environments. That includes crampons, metal spiked devices that get attached to the bottom of your boots and allow you to better walk across icy and slick surfaces. I'm not kidding when I say that the environment is going to be one of the bigger challenges when it comes to catching one of these Pokemon. Also, be ready to possibly spend 1 or 2 days hunting or searching, so overnight camping gear might also be a good idea, along with a fire-type Pokemon that you can use for warmth, as well as battling the Jynx if it comes to that. Dark types would also be a good idea, as they're actually immune to Psychic-type moves. I guess that means Booster is the perfect Smoochum evolution hunter. I don't know what to do with that information, but it does feel good that I have it, I guess. I should also mention, and I'm going to go more into depth with this in the care section, but these Pokemon do have a special fascination and connection with music, so a good way to draw in one of them is to play some music from your campsite. If you're lucky enough to have one of these Pokemon nearby and they like the music you're playing, they may just approach you on their own. Either way, a Pokeball should be good enough to catch a Smoochum, and then Jynx is between a Great Ball and an Ultra Ball, so it's really up to you there. Care. Let's start with the fact that both of the evolutions have specific needs that they have to have met. Smoochum is a very curious creature, constantly exploring their environments and interacting with new things, which the most common way for them to interact with stuff is by kissing them. Well, really, they use their hypersensitive lips to examine the texture and feel of different objects to determine if they like them, but it looks and functions just like it's kissing objects. This means that you have to do a couple things to make sure they get a good amount of mental stimulation from the objects around them, while also making sure that they stay healthy and don't end up getting hurt. What I mean by that is that you have to make sure that you never leave out things like chemicals or cleaners where they can get to them. Or make sure that there aren't things like super hot radiators or things like rodent traps within the smooching range of these guys. All of these kinds of things can not only hurt your Smoochum, leading to an emergency run to the Pokemon Center, but it can also lead to damage to your Smoochum's lips long term, depriving them of that needed stimulation of interacting with new textures and materials. Which brings me to the second point that you need to facilitate that need for Smoochum. You need to regularly introduce new things to their environment, allowing for that mental stimulation and that experience of something new. It's an important part of this Pokemon's development to interact with a bunch of different stuff, and if they are deprived of that, they can end up being overly skittish and frightful later in life, even as a Jynx. As for how often you need to do this, different websites debate on that. I've seen everything from every week to every month, but so long as you're doing it on a regular basis, then you should be good. One last point on Smoochum before we move on to what Jynx needs. Due to this constant use of its lips to explore things, Smoochum need their lips moist and hydrated constantly. In the wild, they do this through the use of tree sap, but in your home, that can lead to some issues where you get sticky sap all over the place. A better option for you to use is a form of unscented comb bee wax. If you get them a large tub and take the time to show your Smoochum that this is what it's for, then it's fairly easy to teach them to use that instead of tree sap. And yeah, that does mean that you'll have big lip prints all over the place on anything that Smoochum decides to check out, but I figure a quick spray and wipe clean is a lot better than having to try to scrape and clean off something as sticky as sap. Man, after going through all of this, I really do think that Smoochum is the closest we've seen in this guide to just straight up having a toddler. When your Smoochum evolves into a Jynx, then their needs are going to change. Instead of constantly needing new things to be exposed to for a lip inspection, Jynx has a very odd predilection for music. Why? Couldn't tell ya, but they have a need to sing, dance, and listen to music of some sort. This is why Jynx has become so widely used in the entertainment industry, as they can be very easily trained and taught new songs. So, one thing that plenty of people do with this Pokemon is that they constantly have music playing in the background. This does two things. One is that it prevents your Jinx from singing at all hours of the night. You don't have to have the music loud, just loud enough to be heard but can still be in the background. But if you don't have anything for your Jinx to listen to, then there's a good chance that they'll start singing instead, which they often do at a loud volume. This can be extra annoying when they do so during the night or when you're trying to watch TV. Having the music playing should prevent that for the most part. There will still be times when they do sing, especially when they get overly happy, but that's an unavoidable circumstance when it comes to this Pokemon. The second thing that having the music does for you is that it'll give the Pokemon plenty of time to dance. This allows them to get all that exercise they need, while also providing that mental stimulation that's so important to psychic types. As long as you can deal with the music in the background of your home all the time, then this really becomes an easy way to keep your Pokemon happy and healthy. I should mention that you might have to do a bit of experimentation to find out what music your Pokemon likes. Not all of them are the same, and I've seen reports online of Jinx liking everything from simple instrumental pieces, to Unnovan country music, to modern Cantonian pop, and even some of the more heavy metal music coming out of the Galar region. It's just a matter of testing and seeing which kind your Jinx prefers. Hopefully, it's something you also enjoy. Thankfully, they are one of the species that you don't have to worry too much about with training. They are smart enough that they should pick up most of the things you want to teach them fairly quickly. And you can even work on getting them to learn some of the more advanced things, such as drinking from cups, eating at the table, and being able to use the toilet instead of going outside, so you can avoid having the cops called on your home for indecency charges. When it comes to food, they are one of the Pokemon that have such close biology to humans that their food is often talked about in human terms. For example, Smoochum is very close to a human toddler in size and behavior, so they'll need about the same caloric intake as one, that being about 1200 to 1500 calories per day, split into 3 different meals. Thankfully, this species is omnivorous, meaning they can have a mixture of both fruit and vegetables, as well as meat, though you only want the meat portion of the meals to be about 3 to 4 ounces, with the rest consisting of a mix of different fruits and veggies. When they evolve into a Jinx, that caloric intake jumps to about 1600 to 1900 calories per day, now split into 2 meals. This is because while Jinx might look like a woman, they are smaller and lighter than the average human person, therefore they need less intake. You want to increase the amount of meat you give them to about 8 ounces of meat for each meal, as they will need the protein to sustain their bodies, and be sure to help them with all the dancing they'll be doing. One last small thing that I wanted to mention with these Pokemon, they have a very strong tendency to keep themselves clean, more specifically their faces. If either of them, but especially Smoochum, see or find that their faces have become filthy in some way, they will rush to wash and clean them to a satisfactory level. To facilitate this, and avoid them from trying to clean themselves in your toilet, I would recommend that you leave a large basin or bin of water out so they can use it for this purpose. Just every morning and night, be sure to empty out the water and scrub the tub, so that you keep that clean as well. If your Smoochum evolution thinks that the water is dirty, then they'll avoid it and find something else. You should also be aware that if you have another Pokemon in the house, or even a human child, they might get into the water and drink from it, meaning you'll have to change it even more often. It's not a big thing, but it can help to keep your Pokemon healthy and happy, and from cleaning themselves in places that you don't want them to. Cost. Thanks to this Pokemon staying in your house, the enclosure cost won't be much. Really, you only have to pay for the bed and maybe the water basin for them to clean their faces. I can't see you spending more than the very low category. Getting all of them secondhand from those online marketplaces, you can really bring the price down there, and I don't think the Pokemon will care. Food will be pretty much the same as paying for another human in the house. So if you have a Smoochum, expect to pay in the moderate category extra per month on your grocery bill. When they evolve into a Jinx, you can expect that to jump up to the high category per month. The Pokemon itself is probably going to be in the high category. Like I mentioned, they aren't the most common Pokemon in the world since human-looking Pokemon aren't that popular. Combine that with the fact that the people that are often coming for these Pokemon are the ones that are looking to use them in the entertainment industry, and the breeders that do sell them can kind of charge more for them than the market would realistically put them at. That being said, if they try to charge you more than the high category, then they're definitely overcharging you. Conclusion. You all know that I'm not a big fan of this kind of Pokemon. The Machop line, the Mr. Mime line, all of them are ones that I just find unsettling. Jinx might just be the most unsettling of them all, with just how close they are to human. Oh, Smoochum isn't that bad, but Jinx is just way too close. That being said, if you are the kind of person that doesn't mind that, then this evolutionary line might be the easiest out of all the human-like Pokemon that we've covered in these guides so far. They're smart enough that training them is fairly easy, and they can learn most of the things around the house that the other indoor psychic types are able to do, but they don't have the same mental stimulation needs that the others have. Realistically, if you don't mind having your house be a bit on the colder end, doing a bit more cleaning around the house than you would without them, and having some music playing around the house at all times, then I can easily see these Pokemon being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the zappy baby Pokemon Elekid and its evolutions Electabuzz and Electivire. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Electric Pokemon are always interesting to research when I do these guides. A lot of them have very different interactions with their elemental energy. There are those, like the Pikachu line, that are able to generate their own power for the most part. On the other side of that spectrum, though, are the Pokemon that get the majority of their electricity by absorbing it from other sources, like the Magnemite line. Realistically, this is more of a sliding scale than a one or the other situation. Most electric-type Pokemon are able to do both, at least to some degree. And the topic of today's guide is pretty much right in the middle of that scale. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the electric Pokemon species Elekid and its evolutions Electabuzz and Electivire. Elekid is a small, 2-foot-tall, 52-pound yellow Pokemon with a round central body. That's 0.6 meters and 23.5 kilos for those of you outside the Unova region. Like I said, Elekid has a round central body that combines both its torso and its head. It has a humanoid body shape with 2 arms and 2 legs, but the arms are much thicker than its frame would suggest, with no wrist at the end and 3 claws at the end of each arm. On the top of its head are 2 rectangular horns with holes at the top. Really, they look like the end of a plug in the Unova region, which makes me wonder if this Pokemon was the inspiration for that. Before we move on to the others in this line, I should mention that Elekid is yet another baby Pokemon. And unlike Smoochum in the last guide, it actually does fit with the description of a baby Pokemon. Elekid actually has trouble generating its own electricity, having to windmill its arms to try and use the motion like a generator. Which honestly wouldn't be that bad, except for the fact that this tires it out so quickly that it can't do it for long. This isn't a major detriment like with Pichu and shocking itself, but I did want to make sure you were all aware going into this guide that Elekid is classified as a baby Pokemon. After some time, Elekid will evolve into an Electabuzz. Fun fact, for the longest time, this was the only form that was thought to exist in this evolutionary line. It wasn't until we fully understood Pokemon breeding that we were able to find that Elekid exists, and then later on with the genetic research and development of specific man-made evolution items that we found that Electabuzz could evolve again. Electabuzz looks very much like a cross between a large feline and some sort of ape or primate. They still have the humanoid body shape, but the arms are now much longer, ending in large hands. Their legs are comparatively shorter, and they now have a feline tail. Their head is more feline in shape, with two large antennae on the top of their head next to a couple tufts of fur. They keep the yellow and black striping from their previous form, though in a different pattern from Elekid. They also get taller and slightly heavier, now standing 3 feet 7 inches, which is 1.1 meters, and weighing about 66 pounds on average, coming out to be an even 30 kilograms. Now, that's where the natural evolution line ends, but if you're able to get your hands on an item known as an electrolyzer, and then send your Electabuzz through a trading machine while holding on to that item, it will trigger a genetic anomaly that was discovered and cause your Electabuzz to evolve into an Electivire. Electivire are massive Pokemon, standing near 6 feet tall and weighing an impressive 305.6 pounds on average. That's 1.8 meters and 138.6 kilos. And when you look at these Pokemon, you can see that the majority of it is all muscle. Electivire is now covered in a shaggy yellow-black fur with muscular arms and legs. It has a wide head with 2 antennae on the top with 2 red eyes. It has gained another tail, and they've changed to be very long and have the look of split live wires, being thin and black with glowing red tips. All in all, they are very unique looking Pokemon, but does that translate to unique and possibly difficult care? Well, let's get into it and find out if these Pokemon are difficult to keep, and if they are possibly the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. One of the things that needs to be understood about these Pokemon is that they are very versatile in the places that they can survive. In the wild, they can be found in places as varied as mountains, forests, and even occasionally in old abandoned urban places. So, when you construct their enclosure, you don't have to focus as much on the actual environment that you place them in, so much as you have to make it interesting for them to be there. There should be things and places for them to explore, interesting nooks and crannies that they can get into and find. Really, go with what you already have as to keep the cost down, and then build up from there. Add in things like a handful of trees, maybe a pile of rocks and dirt that your Pokemon can climb up and down, perhaps a small man-made cave if you want. Places that'll keep your Pokemon engaged with their enclosure. All of these adjustments do mean that these Pokemon can, and do, take up quite a bit of space. Elekid, obviously, takes up the least amount of space, being the smallest of the line. With them, you shouldn't need an enclosure that's more than 20 feet by 20 feet. After all, thanks to their smaller legs, they can't really travel around that well. Once they evolve, however, that changes. Electabuzz does move around its enclosure quite a bit, so you have to expand the enclosure size for them to 100 feet by 100 feet. That might seem like a major upgrade in space, but these Pokemon are constantly on the move around their territory, looking for places where they can get some electrical charge from lightning strikes or other electrical Pokemon. This leads to them needing to wander around quite a bit in the wild. Thankfully, once they find a consistent source of electricity, such as a power generator or the enclosure that we're going to be building, they stop wandering around as much, so we can somewhat limit how spacious the enclosure has to be. Unfortunately, Electivire is a much bigger Pokemon with the same wandering habits, meaning you'll have to increase the size of the enclosure again to about 150 feet on a side. That is a massive space, but Electivire is a very big Pokemon, both in height and in muscle mass. Not giving them adequate space can lead to plenty of issues. Oh, and for those of you that need them, that's 6.1 meters, 30.5 meters, and 45.7 meters respectively. As for what the enclosure wall should be built from, you want to get something that is resistant to electricity and can withstand blows from these Pokemon, especially Electivire. Here, it will really be a matter of preference. I've seen people say they like reinforced glass, as that allows them to look into the enclosure. I've seen people say they like PVC plastic with a rubber coating, as that's the cheapest and allows for easy electrical distribution. I've even seen people say they like to take the Magnemite approach and go with concrete walls with a steel core. No matter what you decide to go with, the wall should be at least 15 feet, 4.5 meters, tall to prevent the Pokemon from jumping and escaping over them, with a steel door on one side for you to access the enclosure and a steel mesh ceiling on the top. That may leave you wondering, why not use a solid ceiling for these Pokemon? Well, not only will this allow fresh air into the enclosure, as well as make it cheaper in the long run, but a large part of these Pokemon's ecology is tied to the thunderstorms. So allowing the rain and thunder and lightning to enter the enclosure will actually do well for your Pokemon. Speaking of storms, you will also have to give your Pokemon some shelter from the elements if you happen to live in an area that gets cold and snows at any point during the year. These Pokemon do fine in the winter, especially the later evolutions with the heavier and thicker fur, but you will still have to have a place where they can go to rest and get out of the cold. Off the side of the enclosure, you should have a separate area that is much like a bedroom for them. There should be a bed, food dish, and other decorations and add-ons you want to add in for them. It will need to be insulated and heated, with lighting that can be turned on and off from the outside, and another door you can use to enter this part of the enclosure, and then a doorway that enters from this part into the rest of the enclosure. One that can also be shut to keep the heat in during the cold months. As for the sizes of the bedrooms, they should be about 5 feet square for Elekid, about 7 feet square for Electabuzz, and about 12 feet square for Electivire. 1.5 meters, 2.1 meters, and 3.7 meters respectively. That might seem small, but remember that this isn't really going to be a spot the Pokemon's going to be spending a lot of time in, and they may even decide that they prefer sleeping outside instead of coming in here, just to be closer to the sky and electricity sources. Before I talk about this next part of the enclosure, there is one thing I want to clear up about these Pokemon. These Pokemon have a bit of a reputation. Mostly Electabuzz, but the others tend to get the rep just because they're part of the same evolutionary line. These Pokemon are oftentimes blamed for the occurrence of blackouts in major cities, which, yes, it can and has happened. These Pokemon are drawn to large concentrations of electricity, and have been known to break into electrical plants to drink from the generators there, causing problems. But let me be very clear here. They are not the cause of all blackouts around the world. There are some regions that don't even have a native population of these guys. Unfortunately, it's become a common practice for companies to blame their failures on these Pokemon over the years, and that has stained the reputation of these Pokemon. Thankfully, the correct information has started to get out all over the world, but the main reason that I bring this up in this section of the guide is that it can really tell us about what some of the things they need in their enclosures are. They will need some form of electrical output in their enclosure for them to drink from. It doesn't have to be anything specific. You could realistically do anything from having outlets in the walls of the enclosure to even having generators in the center of the enclosure for them to pull from. The best ones that I've seen are ones that use the metal rods that we used in the Magnemite enclosure. Here, instead of being anchored to the walls, they're going to be situated on the ground, on top of a thick concrete pad that is at least 4 feet on all sides, 1.2 meters. This block will help to ground a lot of the power in the rod. From there, you'll have wires connected from the rod and run them underground to connect to either your home's power grid or to a separate power source. The wires will also need to be sheathed in rubber insulation to not only keep power from leaking out and shorting out the system, but also keeping the Pokemon from feeling the power coursing through them and digging them up. Through this method, your Pokemon will approach the rod and draw on it for electricity. As for how much electricity you want coursing through this thing, there are two schools of thought on that. One is to have a large burst of electricity all at once, much like how these Pokemon try to get struck by lightning during thunderstorms. It provides them a bunch of energy all at one time. The other method is a slow trickle of energy over a long period of time, as if they were feeding from a power generator in a power plant. Personally, I think that the second method is a better method for captivity. The burst method is done in the wild because lightning strikes are really the only natural sources of electricity that these Pokemon have access to. And when they do this, they tend to congregate in large numbers, dissipating that electrical strike through the entire group. Having just one of them take the whole thing can still overwhelm their system and cause damage. Using the slow feeding method, while yes, it does encourage a bit more of a sedentary lifestyle, also allows you better control over the flow of power to your Pokemon and prevents them from taking too much at once. We'll talk more about feedings and methods of feedings in the care section of the guide, but for now, just know that you should set these rods up to give off low amounts of power when they are powered, and you should have only one of them in the Elekid enclosure, and at least 2 or 3 of them for the later evolutions. This will provide not only a reason for your Pokemon to use their entire enclosure, but also give a bit of variety when they do feed. I feel I should mention this here, even though this enclosure section is going on for way too long. Electivire doesn't technically need these rods, or even the electrical charging spots at all. The evolution from Electabuzz actually fixed their electrical generation problem, allowing them to produce their own electricity and at very high amounts of power at that. Realistically, you could remove the rods we spoke of from an Electivire's enclosure if you wanted to. That would certainly save you on your electric bill, but you may not want to do that. The Pokemon, especially if you've kept it in that enclosure since it was an Elekid, has developed the habit of pulling on that electricity every day. Even if it has evolved and doesn't need it anymore, that doesn't mean that the habit won't be there. If you suddenly remove the rods from the enclosure, then the Pokemon may end up feeling distressed simply because its routine has been disrupted. It's really up to you if you decide to do this, but keep in mind you will have to do some extra training to get the Pokemon used to the idea that it doesn't need outside electrical sources anymore. As for other Pokemon that can be housed with them, you might want to avoid trying to house other species with them. This species has been known to get very territorial towards others, and if you end up trying to house them together, then it might start a fight and end up with one or both of the Pokemon involved getting hurt. Even other electric-type Pokemon wouldn't be a good idea, as they might try to pull the electricity out of them, which at best will cause an issue, and at worst might lead to the other Pokemon left with no energy at all. Really, it might be best to keep them with others of their own species. Thankfully, they don't have such a strong territorial response to each other, after all the dominance battles and dominance showing has settled down. While they don't have to be housed with other Elekid evolutions, they can do just well together, so long as they have enough space to get away from one another if they want to, and there's enough electricity and food to go around. It's when resources begin to get tight that problems can arise between members of the group. Always remember that the specifications I give in these guides are meant for single individuals unless otherwise stated, so be sure to change and expand things if you plan to add in more to the enclosure. Availability. The thing about these Pokemon is that they're exceedingly rare, to the point where most regions don't have a stable wild population of them, only random spottings here and there. They aren't endangered or anything, not like Kangaskhan, but they're certainly not all over the place either. In fact, the places where they're most common are in Alola, where they can be found on routes 12, Blush Mountain and Mount Hakalani, and Galar, where they're found all over the Crown Tundra. Aside from those two regions, they can only be found in Johto on Route 10 and the Safari Zone, here in Sinnoh on Route 222, and in Unova in the Verbank Complex. All the other regions, Hoenn, Paldea, Kalos, and mainland Galar, have no natural population of these Pokemon. Funny enough, Kanto used to have a wild population of these Pokemon that lived in the old power plant that was there, but during the reclamation and refurbishing of the power plant, they were all either caught and sent elsewhere or driven away. Since then, there really hasn't been any wild Elekid evolutions in the Kanto region. And I think it goes without mention that if you are able to get to these places, then you're going to have a hard time finding one of them. Oh, and if you're thinking of getting a wild Electivire, then I suggest you think again. The electrolyzer that's used to facilitate the evolution is a solely man-made item, which I don't think has a wild counterpart, so unless you find an Electivire that some trainer released for some reason, or you find a Pokemon that has gone through a truly astounding amount of wild circumstances, then you're not going to find an Electivire in the wild. When we look at the breeding industry for these Pokemon, it's not the worst, but it's also not the best. These Pokemon, especially the later two evolutions, are decent in the battling scene, and while they aren't the most common Pokemon for people to have in the household, there are a decent amount of people that enjoy them. Not to mention that these guys are pretty easy to care for once you get the enclosure set up, and adding in more to the population doesn't mean you have to build a bunch of other enclosures all over the place. So, if you want to get a captive bred Elekid evolution, then I really don't think you should have any issues. The only thing is that if you want an Electivire right away, then it may be a bit more difficult, as then the breeder will need to go get their hands on an Electrolyzer, which, as far as I'm aware, is more difficult to get than an Evolution Stone. They may not be willing to go through with all that, and if they are, then they're certainly going to charge you for it. Catchability. If you do decide to go after one of these Pokemon in the wild, then you had better be prepared. Not only do they tend to live in hard to get to and dangerous places, but the Pokemon themselves are not exactly safe to be around. These Pokemon tend to live on the sides of mountains or in abandoned urban areas, which have their own dangers to those who aren't prepared, not to mention the latter might be illegal to enter altogether. Make sure you are prepared with the right gear, clothing, and emergency plans if something goes wrong. As for the Pokemon, they aren't the best at storing electricity once they get it. They tend to leak whatever power they get, to the point where Electabuzz has been known to glow with power in the dark. This means that trying to get too close to them is a very bad idea. Almost like getting tased, which isn't fun, let me tell you. I've gotten a few bad volts from my Voltage and my Dynamo, and I highly recommend you bring some shock-resistant clothing and a ground-type Pokemon with you, since that type isn't really affected by electricity. As for what Pokeballs to use, a Pokeball should be plenty strong enough for an Elekid, while you might want to use a Great Ball or even an Ultra Ball for an Electabuzz. And if, by one of Arceus' miracles, you do find a wild Electivire, then certainly use an Ultra Ball for that, and I'll be honest, even that might not be strong enough. Care. When I was looking into the diet needs of these Pokemon, it started to make sense why they adapted to use electricity to power some of their bodily functions, even when their bodies are terrible at storing it. This evolutionary line are herbivores, with the occasional addition of insects in their diet, but because of their size and habitat, there would be no way they could get all their needed dietary necessities from plants alone. They would be eating near constantly, and would strip mountains of their vegetation in weeks. Hence the adaptation to using electricity to compensate for some of that dietary scarcity. When you feed these Pokemon, you want to give them a mix of various fruits, the ones that have a good amount of water content in them, since this is where these Pokemon get the majority of their fluid intake. as well as a mixture of leafy, stem, and root veggies, about 65% and 30%, with the final 5% being some sort of protein. And honestly, even that 5% might be too much. The sugars in the fruit should promote the generation and flow of electricity in the Pokemon's body, while the fiber from the veggies and the protein should help to keep the Pokemon's body up and running well. As for how much to feed them, you want to give Elekid about 4 pounds of food over the course of a day, split into 3 different meals. Electabuzz will jump up to about 6.5 or 7 pounds of food, split into 2 meals a day. That might not seem like a lot, but you have to remember that while Electabuzz is taller than Elekid, it's actually not that much heavier and therefore has less mass to keep up to be healthy than a lot of other evolutions do. That changes, however, when it comes to Electivire. Electivire is such a big jump in size, muscle mass, and electrical generation and retention that even with the benefit of being able to absorb electricity from other sources, they require an immense amount of food. To sustain an Electivire, you have to feed them about 25 pounds of food a day, over the course of 3 meals a day to sustain that kind of body mass. It's an incredible amount of food, and remember, that's with a part of the dietary needs being taken up by the electrical absorption. Imagine what it could have been if they didn't have that adaptation. I will never stop saying this. Fully evolved Pokemon take up a lot of resources to keep. As for training, these Pokemon will come with certain issues. As for the first 2 evolutions, Elekid and Electabuzz, just being around them can be a hazard since they leak electricity. When working with them, you will need things such as shockproof clothing, rubber gloves, and other things that can protect you from that electrical discharge. Once that's covered, you can begin to work with them. For these Pokemon, you want to use a simple positive reinforcement method where if the Pokemon does something you like, then you give it something that it will enjoy, most commonly a treat of some kind. By repeating this action over and over, you will form a positive connection to that action in the Pokemon's mind, which means that the Pokemon is more likely to do that action in the future of their own accord. When you begin, if you got your Pokemon from the wild, then you will have to work on the Pokemon just being okay with you being near it. Like I said in the Enclosure section, they can get fairly territorial, and even may see you as a potential rival. You will need to be very careful at this point using the introduction of food and slow, careful movements to get the Pokemon used to you being around it. I will say that this will be much easier, quicker, and safer if you start with Elekid. It usually doesn't have as much of a territorial instinct to it, and, more importantly, it has less ability to do you harm if it takes exception to you being there. That being said, always have their Pokeball on hand when you interact with these Pokemon just in case, and never enter their enclosure without your protective gear on. It is simply better that way for the both of you. And recognize that some wild Electabuzz may never warm up to you, as any wild Pokemon might. In those cases, you should only be entering the enclosure to clean and to feed them, and the Pokemon should be in their bowls while you do this. But if you got your Pokemon from a breeder, or you manage to catch one of the ones that are willing to be friendly towards you, then you can slowly work your way up from being allowed in the Pokemon space, to being allowed to get close to the Pokemon, and then eventually being able to touch and interact with the Pokemon directly. The observant of you might have noticed that I've only been talking about Elekid and Electabuzz when it comes to the training. And that's because when it comes to Electivire, it's a matter of it was either trained in the early evolutions, or it's not going to be trained. There isn't a lot of data on this because wild Electivire are so rare, but those that have been caught show that they may be too dangerous to train. Pokemon like this have been in the wild their entire lives, and, being an Electivire, It's most likely been the dominant Pokemon in its environment for a while, meaning that it's not going to just submit to a human's commands. If you end up getting a wild Electivire, then you have to treat it like it can't be trained, and only enter the enclosure when it is in its Pokeball. However, if the Electivire was well trained in its earlier evolutions, as they should be when coming from a breeder, then it's a completely different story. So long as your Electabuzz is trained for something, then your Electivire will be as well. That is realistically the only way that you're going to have an Electivire that you can directly interact with. Again, I'm going to reinforce this because this Pokemon has the ability to do a lot of damage to you and the surrounding area if it gets loosed in a populated place. Electabuzz must be trained before evolving. Otherwise, the training will not take. It is very important to remember that. Cost. I'm not gonna lie, the cheapest part of this whole thing might be the Pokemon. With how they can be housed together and the fact that the food needs aren't that bad, at least for the first two evolutions, the price isn't that bad either. Now, don't misunderstand me, it might not be the most expensive thing to breed these Pokemon, but it's also not cheap. The electric bill is going to go up, and they do take up quite a bit of time to train to be friendly towards people. Combine that with the fact that the later evolutions are very good for battlers looking for a decent electric type, and you're probably looking at the low category for Elekid and a moderate category for Electabuzz. As for Electivire, I can see it being anything from the moderate to the high category, depending on how expensive electrolyzers are in the breeder's area. Again, the food won't be terrible for the first two evolutions, but it also won't be super cheap either. Needing that much fruits and veggies is going to mean that you're going to have to start buying in bulk and freezing, or growing your own. But either way, it'll probably be at the different ends of the high category per month for Elekid and Electabuzz. And Electivire is going to be way into the high category. Let's be real here. These enclosures are simple, but they aren't going to be cheap, especially with how big the later two have to be. Add in how much bigger your electric bill is going to be, and, well, let's just say that the only one that I can see being less than the very high category is the Elekid enclosure, and even then, it's still going to be in the high category. Conclusion. In reality, the members of the Elekid line are some of those Pokemon that, if you put in the work and train them and care for them correctly, then they can be fine Pokemon. Well-mannered when trained, decent to interact with when trained, and they have some interesting quirks that I think some people would enjoy dealing with. But these are by no means beginner Pokemon. The electrical leakage alone makes them an intermediate level Pokemon at best. To me, it's best if the person that is caring for them has at least a bit of experience caring for Pokemon that either have some biological thing that makes them difficult to care for, or has dealt with the care of electric Pokemon before. If that happens to be you, and you're looking for another interesting electric type, then I can see these Pokemon being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the fiery volcano Pokemon Magby and its evolutions Magmar and Magmortar. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Fire types themselves are oftentimes hard to keep. I mean, it's fire. Inherently, it's going to burn and consume anything that it can. So, housing and keeping fire-type Pokemon contained can end up being a bit of a pain. Thankfully, the fire Pokemon we've talked about so far in this series have been fairly tame when it comes to heat. The most we've had to deal with are the open flames on the Charmander line and the Ponyta line. Well, today we'll be talking about a Pokemon that not only needs flames and heat to be healthy, but a full-on volcanic environment, poisonous fumes, and extreme heat and molten rock all included. The enclosure section of this guide is going to be ridiculous. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the volcano-dwelling Pokemon Magby and its evolutions Magmar and Magmortar. Magby is yet another baby Pokemon, only being 2 feet 4 inches tall on average, 0.7 meters, and only weighing 47.2 pounds, 21.4 kilograms. Magby's body is predominantly a sort of washed-out red color, with a cream belly and black band around its neck. It has a humanoid body shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a tail. It has 2 claws on each foot and 3 on each arm. It has a short beak of sorts on its mouth, and the top of its head is covered with several lumps or bump-like protrusions. For anyone who hasn't listened to the previous guides where we talk about baby Pokemon, a baby Pokemon is a Pokemon that doesn't have full control over some part of its abilities. For example, Pichu shocks itself with the electricity it generates, and Igglybuff cannot control its bouncing if it starts to bounce. Magby has the unfortunate and destructive inability to control the flame that comes from its mouth. Even being fully healthy and not intending to, hot embers will still drip from the Pokemon's mouth, easily having the ability to set things like dry foliage and housing on fire. As I'm sure you all can imagine, the enclosure and care we're going to have are going to accommodate for that. After some time, Magby will evolve into a Magmar, getting much bigger in the process, standing 4 feet 3 inches, 1.3 meters, and weighing 98.1 pounds, 44.5 kilos. It keeps the humanoid body shape, but the red is much brighter all over its body, along with the yellow in the pattern that makes it look like it has flames on its torso and coming off its head. It now has black banding on its ankles as well as its neck, and its arms seem to be covered in some kind of scaled armor-like plating. Each hand ends with 5 finger-like claws, and each foot still only has 2 claws. Lastly, it still has the bird-like beak, but it now only has 2 lumps on its head extending over its eyes. Its tail has lengthened and now has a flame that burns on the tip, and its back is covered in large spikes as well. In all, a relatively drastic change from the first form to the second form. Much like what happens when this Pokemon evolves yet again. You see, back in the day, Magmar was thought to have been the end of the evolutionary line. But, thanks to a bit of genetic research on the line, it was discovered that Magmar had the genetic potential to evolve once again, but this potential was dormant, unresponsive. To activate these genetics, a device called a Magmarizer was developed, so that if a Magmar was traded while holding that device, it would react and activate those latent genes, leading to the discovery of Magmortar. Magmortar keeps the same general body plan that Magmar had, being a humanoid with red and yellow flame patterns across its body. Its bill has changed color from cream to pink, and the bumps that Magmar had on its forehead are now just one large bump hanging over its eyes. Though the largest difference from Magmar to Magmortar are now with its arms. They don't end in hands anymore, now looking almost like the barrels of a cannon, which isn't a hyperbole. When Magmortar wishes to, it can retract the 3 clawed-like fingers into the arm, leaving the cylinders of the arm open for the Pokemon to launch devastating fire attacks from these arms. I should also mention that Magmortar is also larger than Magmar, standing 5 foot 3 inches tall, or 1.6 meters, and coming in at about 150 pounds, or 68 kilograms. Just looking at their body plans, they don't seem like they would be that much more difficult than other fire types, but once I get into the enclosure and the care sections of this guide, it'll really be the test of whether you can accept these Pokemon as the possible perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. So the immediate problem that we run into when it comes to these Pokemon is the fact that they live in an Arceus darned volcanic environment. And I mean that. They thrive in places with poisonous fumes and extreme temperatures, and even bathe in the lava because their internal body temperatures, especially the later two evolutions, are actually hotter than the average temperature of lava, which is about 1300 to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit or 700 to 1200 degrees Celsius. The average body temp for the Magmar line are 1100 Fahrenheit, 600 Celsius for Magby, 2200 Fahrenheit, 1200 Celsius for Magmar, and Magmortar has an internal temperature of a whopping 3600 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 2000 degrees Celsius. That is utterly insane. Now, I should set some clarifications on this. That is the internal body temps, what the temp is at their core. Their skin is not that hot. Their bodies are designed to not only resist damage from extreme heat, but also to hold and contain it. Their internal biology is designed to work at those temperatures, so if they were to start leaking heat, they would rapidly cool and then grow ill. In fact, that's actually a major concern with Magby. We'll talk more about this in the care section of the guide, but Magby is well known to get sick if away from extreme temps for too long, as it's not yet able to contain its internal heat as well as the others in its line. So that brings us to the issue of needing to have volcanic level heat in the enclosure. Not only that, but it is well documented that these Pokemon heal and reinvigorate their bodies through bathing in the lava. Meaning that, I can't believe I'm about to say this, we have to design an enclosure that includes a pool of lava in it. Let's start simple and start with the dimensions of the enclosure. These Pokemon don't tend to go too far from their lava pools, considering how much they rely on the heat coming off of them. While they do move around and wander about a bit, it isn't to the level that they need a large enclosure specifically for that reason. In fact, I would say that the enclosure sizes that we use for the Elekid line should do well for this line as well. Which works because a lot of people consider the Magby and Elekid lines to be counterparts, thanks to a lot of similarities between them. That means that Magby would get an enclosure that's 20 feet by 20 feet, or 6.1 meters on each side. Then you would upscale that to 100 feet, 30.5 meters a side for Magmar, and 150 feet, 45.7 meters per side for Magmortar. Now that we have the dimensions settled, let's talk about the lava pool, as that's going to affect the rest of the enclosure and how we build it. When designing the pool, something to keep in mind is that lava is actually a very dense, viscous liquid, and anything that is actually less dense than it, such as the fleshy body of a Pokemon, will float on top of it. So when the Pokédex talks about these Pokemon soaking in the lava, it's really talking about them laying on top of it and absorbing the heat from it that way, almost like reverse sunbathing. Surely some part of them does sink into the lava by doing this, but the majority of the Pokemon would actually float on the top. I'm assuming the misunderstanding came from the fact that when these Pokemon were first being examined in the wild, the harsh environment made it hard to study them. This not only led to them missing the existence of Magby, but they also were unable to fully tell what was happening, only seeing the Pokemon approach the pools of lava and not burn. The false idea has stuck around over the years, perpetuated by popular media that these Pokemon actually submerge and bathe in lava, despite the truth being discovered later on. Because of this, while you never need the pool to be more than a foot deep at any point, you should have the pool wide enough to accommodate your Pokemon laying down on it. That means that the diameter of the pool should be your Pokemon's height, plus about a foot or two, so they aren't just hanging off the edge of the pool. As for what the pool should be made of, there are plenty of metals out there that have a higher melting point than lava. You can use things like processed iron, copper if you want to get fancy, though that's going to get expensive, or, more realistically, various grades of steel that all have high melting points above the temp of what we're keeping the lava at. You could, if you really want to spend a lot of money on this, get the pool made out of something like tungsten, but again, just like the copper, that is going to be so ridiculous to get a hold of that steel and iron are your best bets. As for making and maintaining the lava, there are various ways that people have come up with that use complex forms of convection, heating, or trying to use pressure to cause the rocks to melt, but the easiest and simplest way that I've found simply uses other Pokemon, specifically the Slugma line. Before we get into this, let me just clear the air. No, Slugma and Magcargo are not 18,000 degrees in Fahrenheit. That is hotter than the surface of the sun. And while there have been and are hotter things on Earth, if that were the case, then just having one of these Pokemon near any human being would be a major issue. No, the fact that people in the Pokedex say they're that hot is a combination of old folk tales, misunderstanding, and childlike wonder. In reality, their bodies tend to run around 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 982 degrees Celsius. Still very hot, don't get me wrong, but nowhere near where people think it is. Thankfully, it is still plenty hot for our purposes. By having a Slugma evolution in the pool along with some high silica stone, their very presence will cause the stone to melt. It still won't be quick, so you'll have to get this set up before you get your Magby evolution, but over time the rocks will melt into more lava, at which point you continue to add more rocks until the pool is filled. Now, this isn't the Slugma care guide yet, so I won't go into how to care for them, but simply know that thanks to their bodies being composed of mostly magma and lava, there isn't much nutrition in hunting them for your Magby evolution, so they should leave each other alone. Now that that is out of the way, let's talk about the rest of the enclosure. This will need to be a fully enclosed space to keep the heat in, meaning that you're going to need a ceiling as well as the 4 walls. The best thing to make them out of is some high heat resistant concrete. It should be sturdy enough to handle the extreme heat that the internals of the enclosure will be putting off, as well as the occasional splash of lava that'll hit it. It won't be able to withstand constant direct contact with that kind of heat, but it should do just fine in the time it takes for some spilled lava to cool. And these walls and ceiling need to be thick, at least 1.5 feet. Because of that, you'll also need to have supporting beams occasionally throughout the enclosure holding up the ceiling. After all, the later enclosures have a lot of space to cover. Thankfully, since these Pokemon are used to living in places that are mostly rock and heat-blasted scenery, they shouldn't need any major decorations or features inside their enclosure. I mean, most stuff would simply burn in this kind of heat anyway. However, what you can do to try and provide your Pokemon with a bit of enrichment is to add in varied rock formations, adding in a bit of variance to your Pokemon's enclosure. On the side of the enclosure opposite from the lava pool, a steel door should be installed on the side of the enclosure, allowing for you to have access into this enclosure for things like feeding, cleaning, and refilling the lava pool with new rocks. Lastly, when it comes to caring for these Pokemon, we have the other Pokemon that can be housed with them. Obviously, anything that can't survive these intense volcanic atmosphere that you've created inside this enclosure is a no-go, which immediately disqualifies like 95% of all other Pokemon. Add on top of that these Pokemon are active predators, hunting down anything that they can make into a meal. They'll try to eat anything they can get a hold of, including the Sizzlipede line, the Salandit line, and the Larvesta line. If your Magby evolution can probably take it down and make a meal out of it, then it might try. Combine that with the normally timid and scared nature of Magby and the normally stubborn and persistent nature of Magmar and Magmortar, and you don't get a good mix with many other Pokemon. You want to go for things like the Slugma line, obviously, the Geodude line, the Roggenrola line, things that your Magby evolution won't try to eat and probably won't pick a fight with. As for their own species, they can do well together so long as they're able to get space away from one another and there's enough lava to go around, but if that's not the case, then they do perfectly fine on their own. And always remember that I only give you the designs in these enclosures to house one member of the subject species. Adding in more of the species or other species may change the enclosure and care needs away from what I've detailed here. Availability. Here is where I deliver some bad news. These are absolutely one of the Pokemon that you have to get a permit and license to keep. I mean, keeping one involves molten lava, poisonous fumes, and extreme heat. Not only does this present a major danger to you as the Pokemon's caretaker, but also to the surrounding homes and environment if something were to go wrong with the enclosure or a Pokemon. You will have to go through some testing, some classes, apply for the permit, and have your enclosure inspected by professionals before you get your Pokemon, and then have it regularly inspected afterwards just to make sure that things are running as they should and there aren't any issues forming. Being able to keep these Pokemon is going to require a lot of work on your end before you even get a Pokemon. Once you have the correct documentation, hunting down one of these Pokemon is going to be a challenge. One is that they often live in dangerous, hazardous environments. Places like Stark Mountain and the nearby Route 227, Mount Ember on one island near Kanto, and Mount Silver between Johto and Kanto. They're also attracted to industrial places like Fuego Ironworks in Sinnoh and the Verbank Complex in Unova, as well as old abandoned structures like the Burn Tower in Johto. The two places that I would even consider remotely safe to find these Pokemon are the Wela Volcano Park in Alola and the Crown Tundra in the Galar region, which is a bit of an outlier when compared to the rest of the environments that they've settled in. It's widely reported that these Pokemon don't like the cold, yet there's a stable wild population in this cold island off the coast of Galar, a region that is very well known for its rather chillier climate. But for those of you in Hoenn, Paldea, and mainland Kanto and Galar, there are unfortunately no wild Magby evolution populations in your regions. And I should also add that this is only in regards to Magby and Magmar. Magmortar, since it requires a human-made object and a trading machine to evolve, is nearly unheard of in the wild. The few that are out there are there by freak accidents or are Pokemon that were for some reason released. You are very unlikely to find a wild Magmortar. Unfortunately for those of you hoping that the breeding industry can save you where nature can't, I have some bad news. Because of the need for correct government documentation and the crazy enclosure needs that the Pokemon have, they aren't in that much demand by the average person, so they tend not to sell well, and thus breeders tend not to have them. Plus, the enclosure for just one of them is large, expensive, and dangerous, so building an enclosure that can house multiple of them, well, that's a tall order for even the wealthiest breeders out there. Even when it comes to the battling scene, they aren't that popular because there are other fire types out there that are easier to care for and are nearly, if not just as strong as the Magby line. No matter how you slice it, getting a hold of one of these Pokemon is going to be a major hurdle that you'll have to overcome. Catchability. If you decide that you want to go out and catch one of these Pokemon, then you have to be careful about it. You need protective clothing, protective masks, water, food, anything that you can think of that might help you better deal with the most likely harsh environments you're probably facing. Also, check to see if you need to get permission from someone to explore those areas. The places like the Burn Tower and the industrial parks might not be open to some random person just wandering around looking for a Magmar evolution. And please, 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 make sure you tell someone where you're going and what you're doing just in case something goes wrong. And keep in mind that these Pokemon aren't common, even in the areas where they show up. You might spend all day tromping all over a volcano just to never spot one of these Pokemon. Always keep that in mind, please. If you do see these Pokemon, then be sure to have your own Pokemon with you so that you're able to defend yourself from them. Water, ground, and rock types will all be helpful here. Keep in mind that Magby is going to try to run away from you, so be sure to be quick on the throw, and Magmar and Magmortar, while they will initially put up a fight, if they feel they are losing, then they will back off and try to hide from you as well. If this happens, you have to be extra aware of your surroundings. These Pokemon have been known to hold a grudge and will try to follow you and attack you when you don't expect it. These Pokemon do not like to lose in fights, and there have been reports of them stalking and attacking trainers later on after fleeing from battle. And I feel like this should go without saying, but I'm going to do it anyway. Do not try to catch one of these Pokemon while it's out on the lava. If you miss, then you just wasted a ball, and if you hit it and catch it, then the ball's just going to fall in the lava and be destroyed and release the Pokemon anyway. Just wait until the Pokemon moves off the lava before trying to catch them. As for what to use, a Pokeball should be plenty strong enough for Magby. Magmar kind of straddles the line between Great Ball and Ultra Ball, and Magmortar, if you do actually find one in the wild, will definitely need an Ultra Ball. Care. The thing about these Pokemon is that, despite their hostile enclosure environment, they actually can be trained to be very well behaved and well mannered with you. So long as you get them while they're still a Magby, that is. You see, despite the volcanic environment being the best for them evolutionarily, they can do just fine in normal environments for a time. Taking your Magby evolution out of their enclosure for training isn't a bad thing to do. By training them when they're young and still at this shy, timid stage of life, you can ingrain in them the good habits that'll make your Magmar not such a stubborn butthead. The first thing you'll have to work on with them is them being okay with you being around them. And the best way to do so is with food. The Magby line are carnivores, hunting down prey for them to eat. After all, there aren't that many plants that grow on and in an active volcano. They tend to hunt for small prey, things that are easy for them to hunt down and make a meal out of. For the purposes of the Pokemon that we're going to be housing, the best meat would be Sizzlipede meat. Now, these Pokemon do eat quite a bit more than you think they would, as their bodies do burn more calories just through keeping their temperatures as high as they are. For a Magby, you're looking at roughly 4 pounds of meat a day, separated into 3 different meals, one of which we're going to be using for training. Once they evolve into a Magmar, that amount does shoot up to about 10 pounds of food a day, now only 2 meals. At this point, hopefully the training is done and you don't have to worry about using one of the meals for training purposes. Finally, if you decide to take the step into having a Magmortar, then they're going to eat an astounding 20 pounds of meat a day, still split into 2 different meals. It's a lot because, again, they're producing all that heat and fire, but the nice part is that you shouldn't have to prepare it at all. These Pokemon do tend to cook their own food before eating it using their own flames, so you should be able to just throw the meat into their enclosure and let them have at it. Now that we have the food covered, we can move on to Magby's training. You want to do this somewhere that's enclosed, somewhere where the Pokemon has enough space to get away from you if it wants to, but not too far where they can run away from you and never interact with you. It should be somewhere that's fireproof because, as we've talked about, Magby tends to leak embers and fire out of its mouth without meaning to, and we don't want a fire starting out of nowhere. As well, you should have some heat-resistant clothing on as well, so that you avoid getting burned by the Pokemon. Once you have your training spot and your protective gear, use your Pokeball to transport Magby there and let them explore a bit and get used to the area while you're in there with them. They may seem like they're uncomfortable with you in the room, and that's okay. Our main goal right now is starting to forge that bond between you. Remember not to make any sudden moves or loud noises that could possibly startle the Pokemon or set back the training, as you'll have to do this work all over again in that case. Anytime the Pokemon comes near you, you should praise it and gently toss a piece of food near the Pokemon, not at them, as that could freak them out. From here, it's simply going to be a lot of rinse and repeat, slowly teaching your Magby that when it comes near you and doesn't flee, it gets rewarded, and teaches it that you're a good thing that gives food, not something to be afraid of. Over time, it will begin to get closer and closer until eventually you're able to have the Pokemon approach you with no hesitation. This is the basis of your bond with them. From here, you can slowly begin to work on teaching it other things, like how to get along with other Pokemon that it might not be familiar with, expose it to other Pokemon, and, most importantly, how to listen to you and what is okay for it to do and what it's not okay for it to do. This is all very important to do as a Magby, as they are much more receptive at that stage. Once they evolve into a Magmar, all the training they've had will still be there, but that stubborn streak that often comes with the evolutions will make it very hard to teach them new things. Not impossible, just very difficult. I should also mention that any Pokemon that you get from a breeder should already come pre-trained, at least in the basics. If they don't, then you might be able to negotiate to pay less, or you might just want to find a new breeder altogether. Aside from that, it's really just maintenance of the enclosure that you'll have to deal with these guys. Things like cleaning up waste, refilling the lava pool, things like that. I'm going to mention that, though, due to the presence of active lava, the enclosure is going to be filled with gases that are toxic to humans, such as carbon dioxide. This will not harm the Pokemon. With how their anatomy is set up, they can breathe these gases just as well as they can breathe normal air. We, however, cannot breathe this stuff. When you enter the enclosure, you have to wear a full suit that protects you from this environment, along with air canisters that provide air to you. It is vital that you put on this suit and triple check that it's done correctly and you are sealed in before you even open the door to this enclosure. I'm serious, these gases can be an extreme hazard to you and any other creature that comes into contact with them. When you open this door, make sure that there are no unprotected Pokemon or people nearby, as the gas will travel out of the enclosure and pool along the ground, taking some time to disperse. They go over all of this and more when you get certified to have these Pokemon, but I'm telling you this here so you can start internalizing this now. Safety is the #1 concern here. Cost. Look, I know I usually do this section of the guide in 3 parts: the enclosure, the Pokemon, and the food. But let's be realistic here. All of these things are going to be in the very high category. You essentially have to build a concrete bunker for these Pokemon to live in, with an active lava pit in it. You're pretty much building a supervillain's lair. Of course it's going to be in the very high category. And with how tough and dangerous it can be to raise these Pokemon, I don't see a breeder charging you less in the very high category for them either. Maybe if you get one of the untrained Magby, then you can negotiate for a price in the high category, but the price is going to go up just out of danger alone. And as we all know, meat is expensive, especially these days. Sure, Magby might be in the high category if you buy things in bulk and freeze it so it keeps for a while, but there's no going around it. Magmar and Magmortar are going to be in the very high category, no matter what, simply because of how much they eat. No matter how you look at it, this Pokemon line is going to be expensive. Conclusion. These are expert level Pokemon. They are. The only thing, and I really mean the only thing, that keeps me from saying that they should not be kept at all is the fact that you can train and work with them while they're young. If Magby had the same attitude as its evolutions, then I would really say that, in my opinion, these Pokemon shouldn't be kept by the average person. But, as it stands, they can be worked with so long as the person that is caring for them is an expert in handling dangerous and fire-type Pokemon. I'm talking about someone like Bex, the ex-Pokemon Ranger that I know who runs the Fire-type Sanctuary near me. And when I asked her about this line, she even said that the Magby line gives even the workers at the Sanctuary trouble, and those are trained professionals. If it's a Fire-type you want, then I would recommend going for something simpler like a Growlithe, a Torkoal, or a Numel. These Pokemon are really only for experts. And if that happens to be you, and you don't mind the host of challenges that come with this line, then I can possibly see these Pokemon being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the devilish-looking bug Pokemon Pinsir. Have a wonderful night, everyone.